In this video, we're going to take a look at the range of effects that can be created using Photoshop's blending modes located in the options bar of the layers panel, which is just up here, as you can see. So they're all the different blending modes. Now, blending modes specifically control how multiple layers can blend together to create a composite. So think of it as if you had multiple layers, say for example 2, and you had the base layer, which could be the original background layer as I've got here, and then you had a blend layer which sat above the background layer, just like in this example here. I've got multiple layers that actually sit above the background layer. Now, according to the color values that make up each individual layer and the blending modes that are applied, you can end up with some really interesting effects. Now, we're going to go through and take a look at some of the most commonly used blending modes and how you can utilize them in your own photography. Just take note that certain blending modes require certain attributes of a layer or layers in order to notice a visual change in your image. We're going to cover most of them, but the best way to learn blending modes is by getting your hands dirty and experimenting, which is why I've included this file for you to play with. To download the file, all you have to do is right-click on the link below and save target as in order to follow along with me. Okay, so let's get started. Now, the blending modes can be thought of as in categories, as defined by the lines that separate the menu items in the drop-down menu. So as you can see here, this drop-down menu is broken up into 6 segments as defined by those lines. So the first one could be categorized broadly as the basic blending modes, which is normal and dissolve. The second would be the dark blending modes, which is darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, and darker color. The third would be lighten modes, which would be lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color. Now, fourth, we have contrast modes, which would be overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pin light, and hard mix. Fifth, we have comparative blending modes, which would be difference, exclusions, subtract, and divide. And finally, we have composite blending modes, which is basically hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. So I'll quickly show you how these modes will react with an identical layer so you can make some comparisons. Now, I'm going to turn on this particular layer here, which is basically identical to the background layer, except I've removed the right-hand side of the image, just so you can judge. So as you can see here, if I turn off the background layer, I've only got the left-hand side of the image. So I'm going to select that particular layer. Now, for the modes that don't visually change as I go through them, as I mentioned earlier, it's because I don't have the right combination of values, especially using identical layers. And we'll go into that a bit further as we get into this video. So to start out with, we have the normal blending mode, and this is the default mode that all of your layers and images will actually start out on when you first open them up. And it actually doesn't affect how your image looks. It's just the default base. Now, underneath that, we have dissolve. Now, dissolve allows you to dissolve 2 layers together. So the layer that you apply dissolve to will start to dissolve, and you'll start to see the underlying layer come through. And in order to do that with 2 identical layers, I'm actually going to have to make a slight density adjustment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this layer for a second. I'm going to turn off this one, and I'm going to make a quick density adjustment to using levels. And I'm going to just darken it off in the midtones just to make it really obvious. Now, with dissolve, in order to actually see it, you need to reduce the opacity of that layer. So as you can see, as I start to reduce the opacity, you start to see that that layer is dissolving and the underlying layer is actually showing through. Now, it looks very much like grain or a digital grain or noise. And it's not particularly pleasing to the eye unless that's the effect that you're really after. And as I said, it's not something that I particularly use. So let's move on from that. I'll just delete this particular layer. And we'll turn this one back on. So from dissolve, you have the dark blending modes. And these are modes that actually start to increase the density of your layers to really emphasize your demax or your base shadow and things like that. So as you can see here, it also looks like it's actually adding contrast in some respects as well. Now from here you also have the lighten blending modes, which actually start to lighten your image and basically do the opposite of what the dark categorized blending modes do. So as you actually navigate through them, you notice that they not only lighten, but they also increase contrast in certain areas as well. So they're quite interesting to play with. From here we have the actual contrast-based blending modes, such as overlay, and then you've got a series of other variations of that do similar types of contrast adjustments to your images, and some of them are really quite severe and probably not what you're really going to use as a default setting. You'd have to actually make adjustments to them using the opacity and selections and layer masks and whatnot in order to actually utilize them. Now from here we also have the difference from here we also have the comparative blending modes, and this is where you can compare different layers together. And in this example, because that's identical, difference isn't actually going to show me anything. But if I was to quickly say go to image and invert my image, you'd notice now that the difference between the two layers is actually negative image and the positive image using the difference layer. And if we continue on, you've got exclusion and also subtract and divide. So what I'm quickly going to do now is I'm just going to jump back through my history because I want to continue on with this tutorial. So I'm just going to go back to an identical layer once again. And from here we have the hue, saturation, color and luminance blending modes. Now these are really good for isolating the hue and the saturation and color, for example, where you could actually apply adjustments or filter adjustments to just those particular items. So for example, if I wanted to use the luminosity blending mode on this particular layer, I could apply sharpening that would only affect the luminosity tonal values. So it wouldn't actually affect any of the color values, and this is a technique that often has been used in the past in order to add sharpening without actually increasing color noise within your image, because by applying this luminosity blending mode, it's only applying it to the tonal values, not actually the color values. So from that perspective, you can do things like that by isolating the color from the tonal values, which is very useful. The main blending modes that you're primarily going to be using are things like multiply, screen, overlay, and in this case, you might use hue, saturation, color, or luminosity, but particularly multiply, screen, and overlay. So the first example I'm going to show you is I'm going to duplicate the background layer. Now I've duplicated that because I want to add a blending mode to it, and in this case I'm going to add multiply. As you can see there, it's darkened the entire image and it looks a little bit more contrasty. What you can do with this is if you were to use, say, an erase tool, you could actually erase areas of, say, the sky around the actual, around the ship in order to only apply that blending mode to specific areas of your image. Now, of course, this is not the optimum way of actually going about and doing it. But you can also reduce the opacity, so now it starts to look a bit more dramatic, as you can see here. Now, a better way of creating selections is to actually use layer masks, which there is an entire video on coming up shortly. So that's one example of how you can use blending modes with multiple layers. Now to continue on, let's turn this particular layer off. And what I'm going to do is turn on a color fill layer. And as you can see there, it's a solid brown fill layer. Now in this case, what you can do is you can actually, by setting a particular blending mode, you can see now that that particular fill layer has become see-through. And This is extremely useful if you have, say, sketches of images that you've scanned and you want to paint in color areas, or if you have old black and white photos that you want to paint color in over them to colorize them. What you can do is actually, with the paint tool and solid colors, you can actually create new layers where you actually paint over those layers and then use a blending mode in order to see all the detail of that image but still retain the colors that you've added. So in this case, I've added a brown tone to the entire image, as you can see there, but I can still see all of the detail of the image. As you can also see here, I have a layer mask, which I'm going to enable. Now what you'll see by enabling that layer mask, if I turn the visibility on and off, you'll notice here that it's added more density to the entire ship, but it's also made a much richer rust color throughout that ship. And if I was just to quickly show you the actual layer mask itself, if I hold down Alt on a PC or Option on the Mac and actually click on the layer mask, you'll see that that's actually my layer mask, and I'm only applying that fill layer to the areas that are white or lighter shades of gray, so all the black areas are actually excluded. So that's another way that you can actually use blending modes with your images. Now if we continue on this particular line, I'm going to create an image that is quite grungy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply an overall image of a tree trunk to this actual image. So as you can see here, I'm going to select the tree trunk, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically multiply once again, and I'm going to leave the opacity set to 100%. So now it looks really quite grungy. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a border to the top left hand corner. So I'm going to turn that on, and as you can see there, it's actually a black and white image with sort of a border outlay that's in black, as you can see. So the first thing I want to do to this is actually go to the blending mode, and I'm going to select multiply. Now multiply will actually remove all the white from this layer and only keep the black, as you can see there. So all the white's gone, but the black remains. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to reduce the opacity down to about 30%. So just drop that down there. Right, next I'm going to add some diagonal corners, as you can see here. So it's very similar to the last layer, except for it's slightly different shapes in two of the corners. Now I'm also going to use the same multiply effect once again, and I'm going to reduce the opacity down to about 60%, as you can see there. So I can go from a solid black down to about 60%, and that gives me something that becomes slightly see-through. Now the next thing I'm going to do is actually add a film strip to this image. So as you can see there, I have a white film strip with some slightly darker shades in between the actual white outlines of the film. Now, instead of using multiply, which essentially will remove the white out of a layer, I'm going to use overlay, which is actually going to do the opposite. It's actually going to remove the darker areas and the black tones from that layer. So if I go click on the blending modes and set it to overlay, you'll notice now that it's removed those darker areas of that layer, and they are now transparent. Now for this particular layer, I'm going to reduce the opacity to somewhere around maybe 80%. And finally, I'm going to make a slight levels adjustment just to lift the image up a bit with regards to its density, because it was slightly dark. As you can see, by adding multiple layers with different images, different blending modes, and different opacity settings, you can create some pretty amazing effects. And in this particular image, I've created a really grungy effect that has some real character. But having said that, this may not be your cup of tea. The possibilities are endless, and it really comes down to experimenting and being creative, especially if you enjoy building upon your images. All in all, layer blending modes are extremely useful for a multitude of situations and applications, even if you only use them sparingly. In the next video, we'll dive into layer blending styles and how you can use those in conjunction with blending modes to create some even more impressive effects.